everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Listful Soul, a devotion to Mary. So on today's episode, I'm going to be taking another title of Mary, which is Singular Vessel of Devotion. It was something that, really struck me when I was going through the litany of Loreto to see what was the next title that I was going to talk about. So, Singular Vessel of Devotion. So I found this passage from the Imitation of Mary, and I just want to start off by reading an excerpt from this, from the Imitation of Mary. So it says, "My child, you do not have perfect confidence in me. At times you are slow to call on me when you are in need, and at all times you seem unsure of my goodwill toward you. I want you to have all the confidence in me that any son should have in his mother, knowing as he does her tender love and her goodness. Come to me always and everywhere, in all your spiritual and temporal needs, in difficulties of soul and body, in the difficulties of your relatives and friends. My child, in whatever difficult situation you find yourself, invoke my aid and I will intercede for you. If there is anything you want that is not contrary to God's glory and your own salvation, ask me and I will always be ready to hear you. Do not ask for anything unless you also want God's will to be done. Any prayer made to me in that spirit will never be fruitless." That seemed like a very apt passage to recite for the start of this episode, to give you an understanding of who Mary really is to each one of us. And it also helps us in understanding this particular title, Singular Vessel of Devotion. Now, what is a devotion? Is being prayerful a devotion? Or can we say that I am devoted because I regularly go to church? And I think most of us have that understanding that this is what devotion is all about. But in this context, when we talk about devotion, the true sense of its meaning is to have that cheerful promptness and readiness in everything that relates to God's service. In all the duties of religion, in all the duties of life, that is considered as the expression of God's will in our lives. So it's not really about what we're feeling at that moment or the sentiments that we may be going through, but it's really all about the will of God, and being able to and willing to accept and allow the will of God in your life, to allow yourself to intertwine with the will of God in what you will to do. Right? So a devotion is really all about that loyalty and that faithfulness that you have toward a person. And here being that faithfulness and loyalty to Mary. Now, why Mary, you may say? Well, it may be very difficult for us to, think of a total devotion. Like you may ask yourself, but how do I stay devoted to God? What are the different things that I have to do? Now, in the Bible, as we read in the New Testament, when Jesus teaches his disciples, and through the parables that we read, we see that God calls us to be like Jesus. And how do we be like Jesus? The quickest way to Jesus is Mary. And Mary's devotion toward God and toward her son Jesus is the best example, the best mentor we could ever have. And so that is why we look to Mary as a devotion. to her as being that singular vessel, that singular person to whom we can be devoted to. Because once we build on that devotion toward Mary, she brings us closer to her divine Son. So Mary is the perfect example of a devotion. As we see how she devoted herself to her Son and to God. And the one way that we see how Mary fully committed and fully gave her life, completely gave her will to align with the will of God, was when she accepted God's will in her life at the Annunciation. So a few days ago, we had the Feast of the Annunciation. And it was at the Annunciation where we see Mary's devotion to God when she says, "I am the handmaid of the Lord." And it is in Mary's Magnificat that we see her true devotion to God and to His will in her life. So that whole prayer, the Magnificat prayer, really teaches us what Mary's devotion was. It wasn't based of sentiments, but of pure praise, thanksgiving, and of petition to God. And so that's why, I say that Mary is our example of true devotion. And we should start devoting ourselves to her to imitate her and her willingness to say yes to God's will in our lives. And like I said, we need to really look to Mary more toward her devotion to Jesus. Because we see that it is in that true light of her being so devoted to Jesus from the time, it was announced that she was going to conceive the Son of God until the time, even after His death, where she lived for Him and wholly for His service. In the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it says, "What the Catholic faith believes about Mary is based on what it believes about Christ, and what it teaches about Mary illuminates in turn its faith in Christ." So really knowing and understanding how we can imitate Christ, who else better to really understand and know all of this and to make it a part of our lives is by His mother. St. Thomas Aquinas mentioned this, where he says, "Devotion consists in the readiness with which our will conforms itself to the will of God, that this is a principal virtue which was rendered by His Holy Mother. This was the principal virtue which rendered His Most Holy Mother so dear to God." And so Mary is the one and only person who can actually help us to conform God's will to ours, especially in today's world, or in the world that we live in, that has so much going on, that has so much that could lead us astray, that could misguide us. Mary is also known as a woman of prayer. I was reading Pope Benedict XVI in one of his homilies. He made a mention of Mary, and I'm going to just quote it, where he says, "From Mary we learn graciousness and readiness to help. But we also learn humility and generosity in accepting God's will, in the confident conviction that whatever He says in response will be best for us." You may think that it's very easy for someone to come up to you and say, "You know what? Let it be according to God's will. It is God's will. It is God's plan. So, let's just give in." And while it might be easy to say, to be honest, yes, it is difficult to also accept it, especially when it is a will that does not conform to what we may want. But very often we have to further understand, where there is that passage that says that in Romans 8:28 it says, "And we know that God works all things together for the good of those who love him, who are called according to his purpose." Following the example of Mama Mary, in her obedience to God, in her obedience to his will, is not an easy task, is not something that comes easy to anybody. It is a struggle, but I can assure you that it is one that in time will become easy. It is just that you have to start the practice. You have to start interceding to Mama Mary. You need to start devoting your life and understanding her a little better. Because by understanding her is where she will teach you more about her son, and she will draw you closer to him. Conforming to God's will was a very difficult thing for me to really accept. Like I said, in a previous episode, that for me, whenever I wanted to do something, I always thought of everything that could go wrong before even the thought of going ahead with that activity that I wanted to do. But then eventually in time, I started to put my trust more and more in God, I would say, and just believing that whatever he has planned for me is planned for my good. It is not planned for my destruction, but is planned for my building up of his kingdom, is what I truly believe. And sometimes, going according to God's will may not always be in the will that we would like it to be. So there was this time a couple of years ago at my work where, things became so challenging. I think one of the most challenging things is when you have to work with, with different people. And it makes it so complicated because, it's all about being on the same page as them, aligning with their thoughts and their processes. And, there are times where you feel that, the things that you may be suggesting, the options that you are providing make more sense. But for whatever reasons, the other side of the party may not agree to you. And so sometimes that can cause, friction, that can cause frustrations. And so for me, a couple of years ago, I went through that phase. And it was very difficult for me, to the point where I didn't find meaning in my work because I felt that I could do so much more. And that so much more that I was offering was not being accepted as much as I would like it to. And, not allowing me to really show my full potential. And so I contemplated about whether I should leave and, maybe look out for something else. Somewhere that, this would be more welcomed. And I took it up to the Lord. I took this up in prayer to the Lord and I asked him, Lord, what is your will in this area of my life? What is it that I should do? Should I leave and find another job? Or should I stay and continue in this job? And every day I made this prayer during my personal prayer time, asking the Lord, what should I do? It took a couple of days for me to really hear God speak to me. And then one day I asked God, should I stay or should I go? And I heard the Lord saying, stay. And as natural, because my will was that I wanted to go because I wasn't happy in what I was doing, I persisted. And I kept saying, and I kept asking the Lord over and over again, should I stay, Lord, or should I go? And every single day after that, the Lord kept saying, stay. Now that was very difficult for me to take because, like I said, for all of the reasons, I just wanted to go. But the Lord, maybe He had other plans. And so I decided to obey His instruction. And so I stayed. And a few years down the line, I truly understand why the Lord asked me to stay. It was after that time in my life when, yes, I decided to stay on, and things kind of, took a turn at work. It took a good turn, if I may add. I became involved with a group that focuses on the industry of work that I am in. And I was given the opportunity to broaden my knowledge of the industry. I was able to learn more and not just, be within the sphere of what I was doing. And I also got the opportunity to even represent, our organization in one of the conferences that were organized for in this group, in this organization. And that helped me, it helped give me more clarity, and it helped me then to understand that if I had to disobey God's will, and let's say it was where I decided that it's my way or no way at all, and I decided to leave, I wouldn't have had that opportunity to be able to speak about my experience in my career, to be able to bring more people to growing within this industry that I'm in, because it is far more than what we do on a day-to-day basis. So it's important for us to truly be obedient to the will of God, because He always does have it for our good and never for our ill. But what's the most challenging thing of all that most of us face is that acceptance of His will in our life. And so that is something that we can learn through Mary. Through her graciousness, through her readiness to just say yes. And in all of it, to be humble in our yes. Now, Mary shows us also that having a devotion to God is not only for priests and religious, but that we too, as laymen, can. And Mary shows us through her words, actions, and deeds that it is safe for us, lay people, to also give all of it to God. And she wants us to do it through her and with her, just as she was devoted to her Heavenly Father and to her Son. She is also devoted to us. And closer we go to her, the intimate devotion that we have toward her is the key to bringing us one step closer to her Son Jesus, and thereby enabling us to then imitate Him and be the person that God truly wants us to be. So the next time you really have a life-changing decision that you need to make, I would say take it up in prayer. Even if it means asking the Lord this request for a month go ahead and do so until you can clearly hear the Lord guiding you to His will and not to your own. So thank you everyone for joining me on yet another episode of The Listful Soul, a devotion to Mary. If you enjoyed this podcast or wish to send along a question, or maybe if you have a friendly critique, go ahead and drop me an email at listfulsoulpodcast@gmail.com. The music in the introduction and the close of this podcast was composed by Garreth Demello. The artwork in my podcast logo and episode title was designed by Anahita Ray and Fernandes, respectively. You can check them out on their social media handles mentioned below. Do spread the word of my podcast via your social media handles, and let's bring more souls closer to Him. See you on the next episode. Until then, stay blessed and stay safe.